So this is the third of a series of seminars that I've given over the last few months. But if you haven't dialed into any of the others, that's not at all problematic. And the basis of this was that over a year ago now, I wanted to learn a little bit more about universities and the university I worked in and the broader sector. I had some experiences and questions that I didn't really understand about my work, and I wanted to do some more learning around that. So I enrolled in a course that was mostly taught online through Melbourne University, and the Centre of Excellence funded or co-funded me to attend the in-person workshop that completed the course and provided extra information. And as part of the centre co-funding that, I wanted to pass on some of the knowledge and things that I'd learnt in that course. So the idea of these seminars is about understanding the environment that we all work in, either as PhD scholars, young academics, or professional staff. And so that is, we all went to university and did an undergraduate degree, well, particularly for the academic and PhD scholars. And that means that we're prepared to work in a university, but we don't really get any training about the actual industry we work in, which you tend to do if you are training to become a doctor or an engineer. You just, as soon as you have your degree in science, you are ready to work as an academic. But if you want to get something done in your university or understand how decisions are made or why particular things take a really long time to come through, it can help to understand a little bit more about your university and how the industry works. So, as I said, this is the final of these 3 seminars that I've been giving, and it doesn't matter if you've attended all or none up until now. So the first one was focused on trying to understand yourself and your own motivations at work and where you get energised by work and what your future career plans might be focused on. So that was really looking at yourself at work. And then the second one was about trying to understand the institution you work in. So that was very much focused on the university. And this final seminar is a bit broader, and that's looking more at universities collectively and the industry. And this is going to have quite an Australia focus because that was the material that we looked at in the course, but also that's my experience of being at a university is it's very Australia focused. So hopefully this will still be relevant to you because everyone here is currently enrolled or working at an Australian university. This is just a bit of background with some information about the course that I did called the Emerging Leaders and Managers Program. And as I said, these 3 seminars come from that. And some of the things that I'm talking about were the focus of various modules that I did in that course. So understanding yourself at work, understanding the institution, and then trying to understand actually what is the higher education industry and what does that sector aim to do. This one's focused on the industry. And so here are some of the buzzwords that are going around that you might have heard of at the moment. So we're all about impact, we're all agile, and we're all about engagement with industry. So these are words that have been used a lot in terms of politicians talking about universities and research in Australia. And we're going to be going through some of these and working out what drives these kind of trends and buzzwords and what is the source of change in the industry and what are the key issues that affect the sector. So part of this is going to be a little bit of some historical information and also talking about how some of that really high-level government policy actually filters down and affects your university, and more importantly, because that could seem pretty abstract and irrelevant, how some of those like federal government policy changes might actually impact you and your role in the university. So this is just a snapshot of the, as I said, it's very focused on Australia, this information, but this is a snapshot of Australia. We have a very strong tertiary education industry globally. We have 39 universities, and 37 of those are public universities. But really the story of Australia's universities, like in a lot of the Western world, isn't so much about how many students and how many universities we have. It's about how it's been funded and how funding has changed through time. So the financial responsibility for universities rests with the federal government. So they're the ones who implement legislation that has impacts on experiences of being an undergrad or experiences of being a PhD student or being a researcher in an Australian university. But the other really important thing about higher education in Australia and also elsewhere is that it's a big business. So the revenue generated by universities in Australia is $24 billion per year. And a lot of that comes from educating international students in undergraduate and master's programs. So after coal and iron ore, higher education is Australia's third largest export industry. So it's quite important and subject to a lot of things that are happening globally. So I said I'm going to be talking about Australia, but given that Australia's university sector is partly funded by educating international students, it's subject to global influences. And we've certainly seen that in Australia, and we'll talk a bit later, but things like the global financial crisis or where we've had really nasty incidents with international students being subjected to racism and that impacting the desirability of Melbourne or Sydney as a location for international students to come. So that's just a snapshot of the industry at the moment, and we can see it's big. We have a lot of providers of higher education, but the really important thing is money. So here's just some quick questions for people who are at nodes with other participants to think about and just have a very quick chat about is, I just gave a snapshot of where we are today, but can you think of any of the major changes that have occurred in universities over our lifetimes and whether you can think of how these might have impacted you? So I'll just give you like a couple of minutes or a minute just to chat about that. Okay, so looks like you and SNW are having a good chat about that. What did you guys come up with?
Lots of discussion around changes in HECS recently.
Yep.
And also, what else we say? Demand-driven. Demand-driven and quotas. The changes around how universities used to have quotas on how many students they could accept particular courses, and now they can do whatever they want.
Yep, so they're really good responses there about both funding and numbers, which are kind of the drivers here. So I just made up these little timelines that show how we got to that snapshot that I talked about. So really big changes in higher education globally have occurred since World War II. And in general, prior to that, higher education was really peripheral to Australian life. And then since that time, it's become far more central. So in Australia, prior to World War II, we had few universities, we had few students, and we certainly didn't have much of an Australia focus. So prior to World War II, really, anything you were learning about in an Australian university was really very centred on British history and British perspectives. And the other impact that change that has occurred over this time is accessibility. So how it's changed over our lifetimes really is that all of us were able to attend university. So prior to the 1950s, which I understand is well before most people's lifetime began, an Australian child had less than 1% chance of entering university. But by 1960, there'd been a huge expansion. And I have a little token here to ANU, which began in 1946. So throughout time, the policy making around universities in Australia went from being very centred on states and individual universities to being much more centrally controlled in Canberra. And through controlling the finances and revenue to universities, government was able to have more of a control over what was going on in the university. So here are some other markers in the how we got to that snapshot I showed earlier. So the first PhD in Australia was conferred in 1946. Prior to that, anyone in an Australian university who held a doctorate was awarded their degree overseas. But after that World War II period, there was a really big expansion of higher education for lots of reasons, social reasons and political reasons. And this occurred, as I said, this is part of a global trend. So this was also occurring in the UK, Europe, the US, New Zealand, and a little bit later in countries like Japan, and then currently occurring in China and India. So there were some really important government reviews that led to big reform in the sector. So one of them was the Dawkins reform, and that really changed the focus of Australian higher education from an elite system where less than 1% of children would be able to attend university to a mass system where large numbers of students were able to attend. And part of that was the introduction of HECS fees in the 1990s. And for everyone who wasn't educated through an Australian university for undergraduate, that's a system in which individual students contribute partly to the cost of their education fees through a deferred payment. So you attend university, and then after you start to earn a taxable income, you start to contribute back to that. So that changed both the funding but also the accessibility. So here are other words that we talked about was higher participation rates and demand driven. And we really see that as we move towards the time when some of us started to go to university, some of the early career researchers and PhD scholars, it became really market driven. There was big globalization with more international students moving to Australia. And then we start to get impacts on that reliance on international student fees through the global financial crisis. So that's just summarised here. In the 1940s, Australia spent more money on mental institutions than on its universities. So for a primary school age child in the 1940s, you had about twice as much chance of going into one of those mental hospitals as you did as going to university. So about 0.7% of a chance. But nowadays we have more than 1 million enrolled students. And as I said, it's a really large export service industry, and a lot of what I've talked about in terms of those trends are reflecting what's going on globally. So these government reviews and reforms with all these different names are very Australia specific, but a lot of this in terms of the system becoming more accessible and becoming focused on large student numbers and having a contribution that individuals have to pay to that, the user pay system, that is part of a global trend. So I also made a little chart that was looking at the changes in Australian higher education policy during my life cycle. So I started my undergrad in 2001. That was the year after I finished school. And I started my DECRA this time last year. So the entire time in between I've been at university. I've never left a university and stepped into the outside world. So over that period, there's been rapid change. So there was a change that allowed universities to increase their HECS fees and set their own rates, for universities to charge far more. There was a big push to expand how big the system was, so to set targets for how many Australian young people, young adults would be educated in the higher education system. So this was really pushing for, I think the goal was by 2025, 40% of Australians would have an undergraduate education, which is very different from that less than 1% that was sort of just before my parents' time. We had some important reviews, but then we had a lot of pressure in terms of income to universities through the global financial crisis. Then we had more reviews, another review, and another review, and another review. So part of this is to show that some of those experiences that I had at university in terms of how accessible it was to me and how much it cost me or my parents were the direct result of these reviews and government policy decisions, but also to show that being a very important part of the global economy, this is a really volatile environment. So when we have a review done under a Labor government, we have a set of recommendations that set universities off on one pathway, and then we have a different government elected that has different priorities and a different appreciation of universities, and that can set universities off on another pathway. So in addition to having these external pressures like we saw here when student numbers and revenue was affected quite significantly at a lot of unis by what was going on in global economic markets, we also have a lot of volatility in terms of just what's going on in terms of government policy. So that's about these historical trends. And we also see that volatility and policy occurring in other countries. So just essentially exchange the names of the Labor and Coalition, and a lot of Western countries also experience that with different sides of government having different goals and ideas about universities. So the next question to talk about is about universities currently and where funding for your institution comes from. So I said that student fees, particularly from international students who pay a higher rate, are an important revenue stream for universities, but where do you think that funding for your university comes from? What roughly do you think we get more from students or from research grants like the ARC funding the Centre of Excellence, or directly from the government? So that is the next little talking point. So I'll give you a minute to talk about that. Okay, so did anyone have any thoughts about how their institution is funded and the breakdown of funding?
We're a little torn here. What did you guys say?
I'm guessing what 40-20.
So we had 40-20-40. Any others? Lots of shutting. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think I actually put in an answer, so that's valuable.
I need to know.
Well, I guess also the thing is it differs for different institutions. So some institutions in particular don't have strong research-intensive focus where they try to attract large research grants, but instead they try to focus on degrees that are particularly attractive to international students. So, for example, RMIT in Melbourne, possibly, I don't know what it's called now, Western Sydney University, keeps changing its name. Some of those other universities so it really depends according to different universities, but as we discussed, the composition of the sector in terms of student numbers has changed very rapidly, and in 2010, that's quite old, that figure now, student fees accounted for, on average, 35% of university revenue, which is about the same as it was actually before the expansion due to different balances of government priorities. So in total, international students contribute about 17% to the total budget in higher education in Australia. But there's lots of kind of considerations in this balance for the income that universities have. So they have the international student market, but when we're talking about domestic Australian students, so students from Australia, it actually costs more for the university to educate that student than the money that the government provides for educating that student. So there's lots of sort of ways that universities cross-subsidise different activities. So they use international funding to partly fund the education of Australian students and partly aspects of research. So I do have further information on that here. So the contribution of government to higher education comes from 4 forms. So there is money in terms of how much it gives to students, either to pay their HECs themselves or directly to the university, and also grants for research. But that funding to research doesn't occur evenly for each university, and it doesn't occur evenly for each discipline or school within a university. So in terms of competitive grants like the ARC ones, the DECRAs and the Future Fellowships and the Centres of Excellence, there's more of that money being allocated to universities for science and particularly medical science. So we have funding that comes in directly for a purpose, like my DECRA or the Centre of Excellence. We also get, universities also get money through another pot called the Research Block Grant, and that is awarded to universities based on a really complex and ever-changing algorithm, but that's a bigger sum of money that doesn't go to an individual's salary, but that helps fund the university's research infrastructure. And then the other one, which is somewhat out of date now, is the research training scheme, and that provides support to Australian PhD students and masters by research students. And in 2012 to 2013, it provided $656 million from the government to universities for PhD training. So that's a really another valuable resource to universities, and that really demonstrates how valuable PhD students are to the institution, because they bring in a lot of money and they produce a lot of research. So there's a good indication that you're valuable, any PhD students here, including international students, even though they're funded through a different scheme. So that demonstrates that we've had this really rapid increase in the number of students, but that the funding at universities is quite complex. We've got all these grants that depend on various, as I said, really complicated algorithms about how much research the university is doing and the quality of that research and how many PhD students they're training. So that's one change that's quite different from before I would have started university. And the other really big change is the way that universities are run. So Australia is one of the first countries in the world to adopt corporate style management principles at universities. So this was encouraged by government policy in that timeline I showed you. A lot of these reviews, the Dawkins Review, the Bradley Review, the Lomax-Smith Review and the Watt Review have all encouraged a change in the way they expect universities to be run. Universities are more competitive environments and they have a lot of pressure in terms of attracting students and attracting grants and maintaining how much money the government gives them. So in response to that, instead of having kind of what we might think of as a old-fashioned or traditional approach to management in a university where the senior managers are established academics and they're respected because of their academic credentials, now in addition to that we expect them to be strong executive leaders. So universities are managed in a much more business-like way, and that's where we get all these words like to be more entrepreneurial and more corporate-like. Part of this is legislated, the way that universities are run and the expectations around that. But I've noted here that that kind of approach is a significant source of tension at universities. So a lot of academic staff are very opinionated and they have a big investment in their work and they don't necessarily like that universities are run as large businesses, and that can lead to a lot of staff alienation. But this different state of management really goes hand in hand with that trend where universities became much larger, with much larger and more complex budgets. Was the expectation that the people who'd be leading the universities would have experience leading a large business or a large organisation. So this is my next talking point, which might be more relevant to you. So how do you think this trend towards unis getting much larger and having much larger student numbers has impacted your student experience or your experience of being a young academic? And do you think that that has affected your future career aspirations? Did you have any thoughts on this one, Andrea?
I don't think it's affected me personally so much, but Yeah. I do wonder though whether it has affected teaching style and teaching. Yeah, I don't know, but I can't really comment on that. So if you want.
What about at UNSW? Did anyone feel like it had affected them?
So we mentioned that, yeah, I guess, actually I had some comments around, you would think with sort of overall growth in student numbers and the growth in the sector and such, there would be this corresponding growth in faculty positions, and the fact that we don't have that, and I think that's something that a lot of our early career researchers, and myself included, struggle with. And then I gave the example that we're sitting here currently in this incredibly large centre at UNSW, and there's 12 people out there with permanent contracts.
Yep. So that is definitely a major one. So the flip side of that massification is, so from my own experience, prior to that, I would not have been university educated. So it's facilitated me to have higher education, to do a PhD. So I said that the first PhD in Australia was awarded in 1946. I think in 2011 there were 6,500 PhD enrolments in that, awarded in that year alone. And I think there's something like 111,000 PhD holders in Australia. So over that period of time, the increase in undergraduate numbers has seen an increase in PhD numbers, which I've been able to participate in, which I wouldn't have otherwise. But now everyone's getting funneled into a system where the number of academic jobs hasn't increased. So a postdoc was traditionally viewed as a stepping stone into a faculty position, an ongoing position, but there has not been an increase in the number of tenured positions, and particularly in Australia, where we have specific retirement laws, and a lot of academics delay or defer their retirement indefinitely. There has not been the renewal of those positions, even though there's a large number of older workers. So I think about over 50% of the academic workforce in Australia is aged over 50, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot of impending retirement. So here we go. So it's impacted teaching, certainly. A lot of teaching is increasingly done in Australian universities by casuals, not by people who actually have ongoing positions and specific training in higher education teaching. And there's also been a huge increase in the number of researchers at the lower levels. A large number of Australian academics are due to retire, but that's not necessarily going to happen. So the flip side of that increase in student numbers and improvement in the accessibility of higher education, so now a lot of us had a chance to get higher educated instead of going into the insane hospital, is that we won't necessarily have the same opportunities for academic jobs that might have been available at a previous time. Does that sort of connect with people? That feeling that the idea of doing one postdoc and then moving into an ongoing position is long gone and the landscape's changed? It will get less depressing as we move through the slides. So I just want to give an example, because I've talked a little bit about how this high-level government policy can trickle down and affect students or younger academics, both in terms of the opportunities to go to university, how much they're going to pay, the quality of their education and their career aspirations. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the more recent review. So I think that's actually 2016. But more recently, there was another review of the Australian research system as part of the current government's National Innovation and Science Agenda. And this was focused on research policy and funding, but rather than just looking specifically at the university sector, it looked more about how the research system in Australia is integrated and how business works with universities. So it had a real focus on industry and commercialisation and creating a more entrepreneurial culture, which has been a real feature of the Turnbull government. But one of the outcomes of that was it would change how this research block grant was allocated. So I talked about that being one of the really important sources of revenue for the university because it's not attached to a particular person or a particular project. It can be used to build up infrastructure and build up capacity with young researchers. So this is a really important pot of money because it's large and it's really flexible. So it is going to change the way that that is allocated. So before it was very focused on the numbers of students who were coming into PhDs and also on the number and quality of academic papers that were being published. But instead it's going to focus on other incentives to encourage this engagement with industry. And part of that is how it will affect PhDs and ECRs. So for PhDs, instead of just having the standard APA, which is the Australian Postgraduate Award, the scholarship, the stipend for Australian or New Zealand students, and there's a similar one for international students, and many of the PhD stipends that come from other grants are modelled on the APA. So instead of having that, there's the opportunity for universities now to offer flexible scholarships. So they can offer a range of stipend values. So if there's some young gun that a university really wants to get, they can pay them $40,000 a year. And if there's someone else who they don't think is as valuable, they can pay them the standard $28,000 a year or however much it is. So universities will be able to offer scholarships for different values and for longer periods of time. They can also offer more flexible programs instead of just focused on producing a thesis by the end of it, more of a focus on building skills and employability outside of academia, and also an encouragement for universities to organise for their PhD scholars to have business and industry placements. And in terms of early career researchers, the aim is to focus not just on the number of academic papers that a researcher publishes, but also the impact of those papers and how they've engaged with the outside world, whether that's with government or community groups or industry. So it's about it's about the federal government trying to encourage universities to be more engaged and outward looking. So that's just an example of how these reviews and policies decisions can affect individuals who are working at a university. So this won't change anyone's current PhD scholarship, but this will change the way that universities see PhD programs and how they see students and who would be an ideal PhD student. So this is my next thinking point, which is, what do you think are upcoming challenges for universities and researchers at universities, given what I've just spoken about? So just have a quick think about that, and I'm going to get some more water. Did anyone have any ideas on that one?
We were a little bit quiet.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I alluded to one of these earlier. Did anyone have any thoughts on some of these challenges? So the big one really is workforce planning. So I said a large number of academics in Australia and also elsewhere, including the US, are aged, I would say. A lot of them are older but not necessarily planning on retiring. So that presents a huge challenge. If university managers don't know when their staff are going to retire, they can't really plan around that because academic salaries take up a huge proportion of a department's budget. But if you don't know how many staff you're going to have into the future, that makes it really hard if you don't know how they're planning on retiring. And it also makes it hard to equip the younger generation. So a lot of younger academics are employed on short-term contracts, and often they roll on. So you do one contract and one contract and one contract rather than doing a postdoc and then stepping into an ongoing position where you might have more opportunity to build your skills. So if we have uncertainty about how the older generation are going to retire, it makes it hard to prepare the younger generation with the relevant administrative and teaching skills to be academics in the future. So that's a major challenge. These are just other ones we talked about in my course, but we haven't really talked about them. So that's not really that key. So these are just some summary points. So we talked about how the industry is volatile and uncertain. So there's lots of sources of uncertainty, some of them in terms of economic markets, or as I said, everything's globally connected. So changes in one country can affect another. So one example of that is several countries have implemented fixed term limits on postdocs. So you can only be on a postdoc position for 5 years, and then you can no longer be employed on a short-term contract. So if there's no increase in the number of ongoing positions that accompanies that change, all those postdocs are either going to opt out of the system or move to another country. And one example of that was New Zealand, where they drastically reduced the number of postdocs that were federally funded, and then a lot of those New Zealand postdocs moved overseas. So there's a lot of sources of uncertainty. One of them is the government, who attempts to drive change in the higher education sector through funding. And some universities have been more successful than others at managing that uncertainty by diversifying how they get their money, that balance between PhD students, undergrads, and research grants. So the whole sector has been in constant change for 50 years. And as I said, it gets a bit more positive. So although it seems like it's very uncertain now, and particularly when younger academics are facing short-term contracts or job uncertainty, there actually has been a lot of instability in the system for quite some time now, for decades really. So although that can be quite scary, it's also the source of opportunities, and people who are looking to seize on those opportunities, there's the opportunity to do that. So this was a paper that I read in my course. So that's not the same Bradley as the Bradley Review. This is talking about the academic trajectories and career pathways. And they said there's never been an ideal academic or the one way to become an academic. So in this uncertainty, there's actually a lot of opportunity for people to find their own way to successful and enjoyable academic careers, and differentiating themselves. And I guess that's what we're seeing with some of those other reviews that are encouraging industry and business relationships and greater engagement, while that might not suit everybody, that is a different kind of academic to the traditional academic who did their PhD and a postdoc and an ongoing position and is very focused just on publishing. So that's just one example of that, how that instability is actually a source of opportunity and excitement. So in summary, the history of the Australian university sector can be told by the way it's been funded and how that funding has changed through time. But overall, it shifted from an elite system that just educated a very small number of people to a massive global system. And part of that recent change has been the way that universities are run more like in the corporate style than what we might think of in terms of academics running university. And although some of these concepts seem a bit abstract, they actually have an impact on everyone working and studying at a university. So in terms of thinking about your own work, for anyone who was here in the first seminar, we talked about reflective diaries and accounts and writing a career plan. So if either of those were interesting to you, think about continuing or revisiting those. And the other thing I want to emphasise was that at times that uncertainty and unpredictability in research careers can be quite daunting and it can be quite off-putting, but it's also important to think about the flip side of that uncertainty being that it actually gives all of us a lot of freedom to manage our own career. So in other industries where there is a clearer pathway through to the senior levels, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to carve out your own way or the freedom to manage your own career. So although that can be a negative of academia, it can also be a positive. Thank you. Did anyone have any questions or things they wanted to mention from their own experiences or? No?
No, I can say I'm an example of finding my own pathway within academia that's not the traditional.
Yeah, certainly. And
yeah,
one of those pathways that is really opening up is, so university workforce is traditionally broken up into academic roles and professional roles. So people supporting academic work through finance, human resources, research management, student administration, and then the people doing the research. But those barriers are really breaking down and we're getting a lot more people who have strong academic backgrounds using those in part academic work and part professional work. So people who have PhDs helping other people get their PhDs and also doing their own research, or people in research management who have PhDs and are combining. So that's a really flexible career opportunity for people who like working in universities, like research, but don't want to be sitting at a desk by themselves for their next 40 years. Yep, that third way. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.
All right,
Thanks, Sophie.